A group of wealthy teenagers, led by Tunde, strolled through the crowded market, their laughter cutting through the noise of haggling vendors and bustling shoppers. They were dressed in bright clothes, their faces glowing with the arrogance of youth and privilege. The moment they turned the corner, their eyes fell upon a young man sitting by the entrance, his body twisted with crutches and his clothes torn and ragged. Tunde's laughter rang out louder than before. "Look at that! A poor beggar who can't even stand on his own 2 feet," he mocked. His friends joined in, their voices sharp and full of ridicule. One of the bullies stepped closer, eyeing the beggar's worn-out crutches. "You must be so proud of these crutches. You'll never walk again, will you?" His words stung like a whip. The beggar said nothing, his face expressionless, but his eyes, though downcast, held something more. They held a quiet strength. Still, Tunde and his gang continued their cruel display. "Does it feel good to beg for scraps?" Another bully laughed, his voice filled with venom. "Maybe he'll be lucky enough to get a coin or two today." The group's laughter echoed through the air, growing louder and more painful with every passing moment. They circled around him, pushing closer and taunting, taking pleasure in his silence. The beggar's crutches scraped against the ground as he shifted slightly, but he didn't flinch. His eyes never left them. Just as the cruel laughter reached its peak, a quiet stranger passed by. His steps were slow, deliberate, but his gaze sharp. His eyes, dark and knowing, locked onto the beggar for a moment. He saw the way the beggar's gaze followed Tunde's every movement. A slight smile tugged at the stranger's lips, as though he understood something no one else did. "They have no idea," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, but the words were meant for anyone who cared to listen. The bullies didn't notice the stranger. They were too busy basking in the pleasure of their taunts, too consumed by their own superiority. The beggar, still silent, let the words wash over him, his expression unreadable. The stranger stood still, watching for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the scene. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence felt louder than any words. He understood the power in waiting, in letting things unfold. The bullies were so caught up in their own enjoyment that they failed to notice the quiet observer in the background. They didn't notice the beggar's watchful eyes or the mysterious man who saw more than they could. As the group of teenagers finally turned to leave, Tunde gave one last laugh, a sound that lingered in the air. "We've made his day. He'll never forget us," he said, smug satisfaction in his voice. The bullies walked away, still unaware of the silent presence that had witnessed it all. The beggar remained where he was, his eyes following them as they disappeared into the crowd. But there was something in his gaze now, a flicker of something more than just resignation. His lips curled into the slightest of smirks. He had said nothing, but in that moment, he had spoken volumes. "They'll see soon enough," the beggar whispered under his breath, barely audible above the noise of the market. His words were soft, but they carried a weight, a promise. The crowd moved on, life continued, but the tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Chike, a young and strikingly handsome businessman, had everything many people dreamed of: wealth, influence, and a life of luxury. He drove the finest cars, wore the most expensive suits, and walked with an air of success that others admired and envied. But deep inside, something was missing. His wealth, inherited and hard-earned, had distanced him from the very people who had once shaped his life. He found himself alone in a world that valued material possessions over human connection. The more he had, the more isolated he became. "I need to see the world through their eyes," Chike thought to himself as he stood in front of a mirror one evening, examining his reflection. "Maybe then I can understand." It wasn't just his loneliness that drove him. It was the nagging sense that something was wrong in the world. People no longer valued kindness, empathy, or respect. They valued wealth, status, and appearances. Chike had come to a hard truth. His family's riches had changed them. His father, once a humble man, now barely recognized his own roots, and his mother, always lost in social circles, seemed more concerned with the next designer handbag than the struggles of their people. Chike, too, had become part of the elite class. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his wealth had made him blind, just like everyone else. He needed answers. He needed to know why the world had become so cruel and disconnected, why his family had abandoned the values they once held dear. So Chike did what most would never consider. He decided to walk away from his life of privilege and become invisible, to live as someone who had nothing. He disguised himself as a beggar, wearing tattered clothes and using crutches to give the illusion of being disabled. His goal was simple: to understand how people really treated the poor. He was determined to witness firsthand how society treated those it deemed insignificant. "I need to know why we've lost touch," he confided in his trusted friend. "I need to see if people are still kind." Living as a beggar wasn't easy, but Chike was used to discomfort for a purpose. Each day he sat in different parts of the city, watching people walk by without giving him a second glance. His suit and shiny shoes were replaced with rags, and his well-kept hands were hidden beneath old, worn gloves. To the world, he was just another beggar, a man they could ignore without guilt. But in his heart, he was still the same Chike, the man who had once been filled with purpose. Now, he was learning the true cost of wealth, and it was more than he had bargained for. "I don't even know these people anymore," he whispered to himself, staring at the ground. "They only see the suit in the car, not the man inside." As he spent days on end sitting in silence, Chike began to witness something that broke his heart. People treated him with disdain, some mocking him openly, others pretending not to see him at all. The poor were invisible to them, nothing but background noise in a society obsessed with appearances. Chike wasn't angry. He was confused, yearning for a connection that seemed impossible. One afternoon, while Chike sat by the market, a loud voice broke his thoughts. It was Tunde, a young man known for his arrogance and popularity. Tunde was the leader of a group of teenagers, wealthy, entitled, and cruel. He laughed as he approached, his friends following in his wake like loyal shadows. They were all dressed in the finest clothes, their shoes gleaming in the sunlight. "Look at this beggar," Tunde mocked loudly, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "He should know his place." Chike didn't react. He had seen this behavior too many times. Tunde and his friends took great pleasure in mocking the less fortunate, and they never held back. They continued to taunt him, making jokes about his crutches and the pitiful state of his clothes. But Chike kept his gaze steady, unfazed by their words. He had seen their type before. Tunde's cruelty wasn't new to him, but it hurt all the same. One of Tunde's friends sneered, stepping closer to Chike. "The poor are nothing but entertainment for us," he said with a cruel laugh. Chike's mind raced. He knew that Tunde was the kind of person who thought he could do whatever he wanted, simply because he had money. But Chike wasn't interested in fighting. He wasn't looking for revenge. He had a different plan, a plan that would make Tunde see the consequences of his actions without lifting a finger in violence. "They think they can laugh at people," Chike thought, his fists clenched beneath his rags. "But I'll show them what it feels like to be underestimated." Days passed, and Chike's patience grew. He continued his silent observation, witnessing the cruelty of Tunde and his gang time and again. He saw how they mocked the elderly man who sold peanuts at the corner, how they laughed at the beggar woman with a child at her side. Each time, Chike's resolve hardened. He would not confront Tunde directly. No, he had a different plan. A plan that would make Tunde and his followers face the full weight of their ignorance. "I will wait," Chike told himself. Watching Tunde and his friends walk past once again, their laughter echoing in the distance. "The moment will come when they can't ignore me." As the days turned into weeks, Chike began to feel the true weight of the disguise he had chosen. He wasn't just pretending to be a beggar. He was living the life of one. He felt the ache of loneliness, the sting of being invisible, the rejection from a society that only cared about wealth. Yet there was something liberating about it too. He was free from the expectations placed on him. He was no longer a businessman, a son of privilege. He was just a man, struggling like so many others. "This is what it feels like to be invisible," Chike whispered to himself one evening as he sat by a dusty street corner, his body exhausted from the day's work. To be nothing in their eyes. But he wasn't nothing. He had a purpose. And now it was time to prepare. Chike began to put his plan into motion. He knew it wouldn't be enough to simply confront Tunde. No, he wanted to shake Tunde's world, to show him the depth of the harm he had caused. He wanted Tunde to see what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be mocked, to be invisible. The moment of truth will come when he least expects it. Chike thought, his voice low, filled with determination. The time for action was drawing near, and he would be ready. Days dragged on, and Chike's disguise remained effective. The bullies, led by Tunde, continued their cruel taunts, never once suspecting the beggar they mocked was the very man they had mocked and ridiculed from afar. Every day, they targeted him, using him as the butt of their jokes. Chike's crutches and tattered clothes were a constant source of amusement for them. Tunde's laughter rang out across the market as he sneered, "Look at this fool. Does he think anyone will help him?" The rest of the group joined in, their mocking voices echoing, but Chike remained silent, unfazed by their cruelty. He had seen this before. This was not new to him. He had been in the position of the poor and the unseen before, and now he was watching it from a different vantage point. He observed every sneer, every joke, every cruel comment, silently recording their actions, knowing that soon he would reveal the truth. The world needs to see how they treat the vulnerable, Chike thought quietly to himself. His heart burned with determination. He was patient. He knew his time would come. Despite the cruelty surrounding him, Chike began to act in subtle ways to bring change. He helped when no one else did, offering food to those in need, giving away money to children selling their wares, and helping the elderly cross the busy streets. At first, no one connected these acts of kindness to the beggar, sitting quietly on the corner. But soon, whispers began to circulate. "That beggar, he's different," one of the market vendors remarked, gazing at Chike as he handed a loaf of bread to a hungry child. "He's helped more people than anyone else here." As the days passed, the people began to notice something strange about Chike. He wasn't the cruel, silent beggar they had assumed him to be. There was kindness in his eyes, a quiet dignity despite his rags. But Tunde and his gang, too, began to notice. Their earlier confidence was shaken as people began talking about the beggar in ways they hadn't before. "Why is everyone talking about him?" one of Tunde's friends muttered. "Is he some kind of saint?" Tunde, however, laughed dismissively. "Impossible. He's just a beggar. Nothing more." But even Tunde couldn't shake the growing suspicion. The more people spoke about the beggar's acts of kindness, the more Tunde's arrogance began to crack. He refused to believe that anyone, especially someone he saw as beneath him, could have such a positive influence on the world. Frustrated by the attention the beggar was receiving, Tunde decided to take action. One afternoon, with a large group of his friends and some younger students in tow, he walked to the market and found Chike sitting as he usually did, near a corner. Tunde's plan was simple. He would make the beggar the punchline of a cruel joke, mocking him in front of the younger students to show his superiority. "Look at this beggar," Tunde taunted loudly, using the moment to turn the younger students' attention to Chike. "Who would want to be like him? Look at the example he's setting for you." The crowd fell into an uncomfortable silence for a moment, but then something unexpected happened. One of the younger students, emboldened by the injustice they had witnessed, stood up and spoke out. "You're the real joke here, Tunde," the student said, his voice trembling but resolute. Tunde froze, his mouth hanging open. The younger students had begun to realize the depths of Tunde's cruelty, and they weren't afraid to speak out anymore. "You can't keep pushing people around. This is wrong, and you know it," another student added, crossing their arms in defiance. The students with rebellion caught on like wildfire. They were no longer scared of Tunde. Word began to spread, and more people in the market started to gather, murmuring about Tunde's behavior. The once untouchable bully was now on the receiving end of judgment, and for the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. Chike, observing the shift in the crowd, knew the time had come. He had been waiting for the right moment, and it was finally here. With a quiet resolve, he stood up and walked into the center of the market, his crutches in hand. The crowd parted as he moved, sensing that something important was about to happen. He paused, looking at the shocked faces of the people who had witnessed his years of suffering and silence. In one fluid motion, Chike removed his crutches and stood tall, his posture strong and confident. The rags fell away to reveal a sharp, well-tailored suit underneath, and the crowd gasped in disbelief. Chike, the beggar they had all come to pity, was now a powerful figure, a wealthy businessman standing before them in full regalia. "I am Chike, the man you've mocked. The man you thought was beneath you," he announced, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. The crowd erupted in shock. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is this really him? The beggar was a millionaire?" Tunde and his friends stood frozen in place, their faces drained of color. They looked to one another, unsure of what to do, the reality of their actions sinking in. They had humiliated a man who was not only their equal, but far beyond their understanding. Tunde, his arrogance completely shattered, tried to stammer out an explanation. "I didn't know. I never meant for it to go this far." His words faltered, and his voice cracked under the weight of his shame. Chike, now standing in full view of the crowd, turned his gaze toward Tunde and his friends. His expression was serious, but there was a note of compassion in his voice as he spoke. "You mocked me for being poor, but you should be ashamed of how you treat people. We are all human, no matter our wealth or status. What matters is how we treat each other, not what we have or don't have." The words struck deep. The crowd, now fully aware of the truth, began to murmur among themselves. Many of them had seen Chike's kindness while he was in disguise, but they had ignored it, just as they had ignored the beggars on the streets. They had judged him based on appearances, just as Tunde had. A woman from the market, tears in her eyes, stepped forward. "I never would have guessed," she said softly. "I've learned my lesson. We all should treat others better." The message had spread. Chike's simple act of exposing the truth had not only revealed the cruelty of Tunde and his group, but had also opened the eyes of the entire market. They began to realize that kindness and humility were far more valuable than wealth and status. Tunde and his gang, now thoroughly embarrassed, stood silently, their heads hanging low. They had been humbled in a way they would never forget. The crowd that had once feared them now stood in judgment. Chike had taught them all a lesson, and it was one that would resonate for a long time. The market, once filled with judgment and scorn, began to feel different. People looked at each other with new eyes, understanding that compassion and respect for others, regardless of their social status, was the true measure of a person's worth. Chike stood in the center of the market. The transformation was nothing short of jaw-dropping. The once feeble beggar, propped up by crutches and cloaked in tattered rags, now stood tall, shedding his disguise. His strong, healthy body, once hidden beneath layers of clothing, was now fully visible to the crowd. He wore an elegant suit, expensive, tailored, and polished. The crutches that had supported him for so long now lay discarded on the ground beside him. The market fell into a stunned silence. The crowd's gasps were audible as they began to piece together the truth. "Is he really?" someone whispered in disbelief. Another voice, filled with shock, responded, "That's the beggar? No way!" Tunde and his friends stood frozen, their mouths agape, still struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The man they had mocked and belittled for so long was not the beggar they had assumed him to be. The realization hit them like a wave, but their minds refused to catch up with the truth. Tunde's face twisted in confusion, his once confident sneer faltering. "This can't be. How could you?" But Chike, calm and composed, did not give Tunde the satisfaction of stammering an answer. Instead, he turned directly to him, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You laughed at me, mocked my struggles, and yet you failed to see the man behind the mask," Chike said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "You, Tunde, are the real beggar, begging for respect in all the wrong ways." His words hit Tunde like a punch to the gut. The smug arrogance that had once defined him began to melt away. His posture, once so proud and intimidating, faltered. He tried to stand tall, but the weight of Chike's words pressed on him, causing his confidence to crumble. I never thought it would be like this," Tunde muttered, his voice weak and unsure. He couldn't meet Chike's gaze, instead staring down at the ground as if searching for an escape. But there was no escaping the reality that had been laid bare before him. Chike, however, did not speak with anger. His words were reflective, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of years of hidden pain. "You see only what you want to see," he continued, his voice steady but piercing. "The world is bigger than your wealth, Tunde. It's not about what you have, but what you do with it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in Tunde's demeanor. Whispers of disbelief spread like wildfire, but the tension in the air was palpable. A bystander watching the exchange whispered, "This is it! He's teaching him." Another voice, a little louder, followed, "He's turning it all around." The silence in the market grew heavier as Chike's words sank in. The people around him, those who had witnessed his kindness even while disguised as a beggar, now understood the lesson he was imparting. Chike wasn't just confronting Tunde for his cruelty toward him. He was speaking for everyone who had been judged based on appearances, for everyone who had suffered under the weight of societal expectations and prejudices. Tunde, now aware of the full extent of his wrongdoings, attempted to apologize, but the words came out clumsy and half-hearted. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it." Chike, however, was unmoved. He didn't need to hear empty words. He had lived through the consequences of cruelty, and he knew that apologies alone weren't enough. "Words are easy, Tunde. Change isn't," Chike replied firmly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You want redemption? Prove it." His voice was unwavering, a challenge in those words. Chike didn't want apologies. He wanted transformation. He wasn't going to let Tunde off the hook so easily. Instead, he gave him a choice. "You have a choice, Tunde," Chike continued, his tone calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Choose to change or choose to stay the same. But remember, the world is watching." The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. The crowd fell into an expectant silence, waiting to see what Tunde would do. Would he embrace the chance to redeem himself, or would he continue down the path of arrogance and cruelty? The decision lay squarely in his hands. Tunde stood there, frozen, his pride and shame warring within him. He looked around, his gaze flicking to his friends, but they remained silent, no longer offering their support. The realization that his actions had consequences, real, lasting consequences, was sinking in. But it was not an easy thing to face. The internal struggle was visible on his face. He was torn between his pride and the dawning understanding that Chike was right. What do I do now? Tunde thought, his mind racing. What if he's right? The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for Tunde's response. Their eyes were on him, waiting to see if he would take the step toward change. A voice from the crowd spoke softly, almost reverently. Will he change, or will he stay the same? But Tunde said nothing. He stood there, silent, as the weight of his past actions and Chike's challenge settled on his shoulders. He couldn't bring himself to answer, not yet. The market buzzed with speculation. Would Tunde, once the bully, be able to transform and take the higher road, or would he retreat back into his old ways, choosing pride and ignorance over growth? In the final moment, Tunde remained silent, the choice left unspoken. The market, once filled with laughter and mockery, now seemed to echo with a deeper understanding of the consequences of cruelty, as well as the possibility for redemption. But for now, Tunde's silence was all that remained. The crowd murmured, uncertain of what would come next. The lesson had been taught, but would it be received? The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, waiting for Tunde's decision, waiting for the next chapter in this story of change and self-realization. The aftermath of Chike's revelation sent ripples through the community, and none felt the impact more than Tunde. Once the untouchable leader of his circle, the young man found himself rapidly falling from grace. His arrogance, once admired and feared, was now the subject of ridicule and gossip. Everywhere he went, whispers followed. "Did you hear about Tunde?" A student whispered in the hallway. "He was mocking a billionaire and didn't even know it." Another voice quickly chimed in. "Can you believe that? The guy who made fun of the beggar? Turns out, he wasn't a beggar at all." Tunde's ears burned with embarrassment every time the gossip reached his ears. The image he had carefully cultivated, the confident, powerful young man who could do no wrong, was unraveling faster than he could keep up with. But the most painful blow came from his own friends. One by one, they began to pull away from him, their faces shifting from camaraderie to discomfort whenever they saw him. "I can't hang around with you anymore, man," one of his closest friends said, his voice full of regret. "That was messed up. I didn't know you were like that." Tunde stood in silence, unable to form words. The social circle that once revolved around him now shrank to nothing. His popularity faded into obscurity, replaced by whispers and stares. He wandered the halls of school like a shadow, his confidence completely shattered. "I I thought I was untouchable, Tunde thought to himself. How did it all change so fast? The answers were clear, and he knew it was his own arrogance and cruelty that had caused his fall. Chike, watching from a distance, wasn't interested in Tunde's downfall. Instead, he used this moment to approach Tunde once more, not to gloat, but to remind him of the lessons that had been imparted. Success is not about how high you rise, Tunde, Chike said gently, his voice kind but firm. It's about how many people you help along the way. Tunde looked up at him, his eyes hollow from the shame he now carried. He understood. For the first time, he understood what Chike had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about wealth, power, or social status. It was about humility and how one treated others. Chike, on the other hand, had no interest in flaunting his wealth. Though his identity as a billionaire was no longer a secret, he returned to his life quietly, continuing to help others without seeking recognition. He donated anonymously to local charities and helped those in need in ways that no one could trace back to him. It's not about showing off, Chike thought to himself as he made his quiet contributions. It's about making a difference in the quietest of ways. A charity worker would later remark, "We received a generous donation from an anonymous benefactor. Whoever they are, they've changed lives." Meanwhile, Tunde began to reflect on the lessons he had learned. Over time, the arrogance that once defined him began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of the importance of kindness and humility. Though his transformation was slow, it was a start. He began to volunteer at a local charity, helping those less fortunate without expecting anything in return. "This is where I start," Tunde said to himself one day, looking at the group of children he was helping with their studies. "I owe it to them and to myself." The process wasn't easy. At first, Tunde hesitated, unsure of his place among the people he had once looked down on. But slowly, as he spent more time helping, he realized that true fulfillment didn't come from mocking others. It came from making a positive difference. Unbeknownst to him, Chike continued his quiet work of helping others, seeing the transformation not only in the community but in Tunde as well. He never sought credit for his efforts, but he was content knowing his actions had planted the seed for change. A neighbor, observing Tunde's newfound humility, remarked, "There's something different about Tunde these days. He's not the same person he used to be." Tunde's journey didn't end with volunteering. It was only the beginning. He began to seek out the younger students he had once bullied, approaching them with genuine apologies. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," Tunde said one afternoon to a younger student who had been the target of his ridicule. "I was wrong, and I want to make it right." The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that Tunde had never shown before. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and it would take time, but Tunde was committed to making amends. As the story of Tunde's transformation spread, it became clear that even the most arrogant among us could change, if they were willing to learn and grow. And for Tunde, the journey was just beginning. "I don't want to be the person I was," he said, with new resolve. "I'm going to do better from now on." The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Tunde had begun his transformation. The lessons learned from Chike would shape the man he would become. And though his redemption was a long process, it was a process that had started with one small but powerful step. In the end, the story left hope, a reminder that no matter how far someone has fallen, it's never too late to rise again. 6. Moral reflection, approximately 200 words. As the dust settles on Chike's incredible journey, the true lesson of the story begins to shine through. It's a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that status means nothing without character. Chike's decision to disguise himself as a beggar exposed the pride, prejudice, and cruelty that people often hide behind smiles. He didn't just test Tunde, he tested an entire society's heart. A passerby, watching the events unfold, murmurs, "You never know who's watching or who's hiding behind a disguise." Through every step, Chike's message was simple but firm: treat people with dignity. Whether rich or poor, dressed in rags or robes, every human being deserves respect. He says, true worth isn't in what you see, it's in how you treat others. The story also reveals how quickly relationships built on status can crumble. Tunde's friends abandoned him, proving those ties were never rooted in loyalty. It wasn't about friendship, a former friend admits. It was all about status. In the end, Tunde learns that justice isn't always loud. It sometimes comes through reflection and change. It's not too late to be better, to do better, he says, signaling hope. Because true value lies not in wealth, but in the heart.